Dave and Dujanovic, your morning companions for talk, analysis, and key perspectives on Utah's biggest stories on KSL News Radio.
I just want to let you know right up front that we're going to discuss the topic of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, in light of the release of the movie this weekend based on a book by Colleen Hoover. The movie's entitled It Ends With Us.
If one day you had a daughter, what would you say to her? She came to you and said the person she loved was hurting her. What would you say to her?
None of this is your fault.
You and I both saw this show this weekend.
Yeah.
My wife and I went on Saturday night, and I knew exactly what this movie was. I knew it dealt with domestic violence. So, folks, if you haven't seen it or you don't want the spoiler alert, we're going to be talking about it because I think it's absolutely crucial to have a conversation about domestic violence because this made me look at domestic violence differently. In fact, as soon as the movie ended, Debbie, I turned to my wife. I said, it probably sounds a little hyperbolic at this point, but I truly believe it. I said, this movie is going to save lives. It made me realize and look at things in a different light, and I had a better understanding. I thought it was a very impactful movie, and I thought it was excellent.
Well, I certainly cried in the movie. I also listened to the book on Audible. So I usually do that traditionally before I go see a movie that is based on a book. I will purposefully listen to the book or read the book, and this time I chose to listen to it on Audible. And the book is very intense, like the movie. There were different scenes in the book, and there were different situations in the book that were not clearly included in the movie, and it happens a lot as they adapt for screenplays based on books. If you're not familiar with the plot of it, it is the author at the end of the book talks about how it was based on domestic violence that her mom dealt with, and her mom divorced her father at a very, very when she was a very young child, like 3 years old. And the character of the book, the main character, Lily Bloom, meets a neurosurgeon, and they fall in love, and she learns throughout the course of their relationship, even before they get married, that he has this tendency toward violence. Now, the tendency was more clear, I think, made more clear in the book than it was in the movie. I think towards the end of the movie, they kind of reflect on the different violence situations where he was blaming her for the different instances, and she was more accepting that it might have been her in the movie. Well, I think it was more clear in the book. That's just my opinion, and my read of the book was it was more clear to her in the book that, and also her mom, in the book, was also a victim of domestic violence, very violent, witnessed very violent scenes between her father and her mom. So there was this cycle in her life of domestic violence that she promised she would never carry into her own life. And here she was, mid-20s, and she's involved in this relationship with this neurosurgeon where there's domestic violence. So it did bring to light to me, it reminds me that we so often want to make, I want to say excuses. Jen, I don't know if that's the right word, but you're the expert, Jen Oxborough, who has dealt for many years with domestic violence and family counseling, licensed clinical social worker. I think so often in intimate partner relations, we tend to want to, I want to say, make excuses for our partners' behaviors. And then when somebody from the outside is looking in, they can't imagine that we're putting up with this or dealing with this. But how would you couch that cycle?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's such an important conversation. And Dave, I love what you just said about constantly finding new ways to think about this and understand it and be there to support the people that we love if they're going through this. But I think there is a strong tendency to normalize because this is a crime that's different than any other crime I can think of, right? This is a crime, criminal behavior that is perpetrated by someone that you love also, that you share children with, that you share a home with, that you share history with. And so that's a really unique dynamic, and it can be very, very difficult. And to me, it's very much both and. You can both love someone and not be safe. You can love someone and leave or try to leave in order to have a safer life for you and your children. And it's very complex.
Jen, one thing that stood out to me when I was watching this show, and this isn't the first show that ever dealt with domestic violence in a movie, but typically when I see it in a movie, the character, the abuser, is a monster, right? And that's very much the lane they live in. In this movie, it showed more of the relationship, and there were some redeeming qualities in this guy. And even though the acts were monstrous, he wasn't portrayed as a monster. And where it resonated, and maybe I started getting a different understanding is, to your point, these are still people that are loved. They're perhaps loved by their children or loved by their spouse. Even though this monstrous act occurred, it's easier to just put them in a corner and say they're a monster and there's nothing redeeming about them.
Yeah, we're all multitudes, right, Dave? We're all multitudes. We are a lot of different things. And I've been a therapist for a long time. I've worked in a lot of different settings. And I would say that I really haven't met too many monsters, right? Like most of us have different aspects of our life where, you can both be controlling and abusive and aggressive and also a hard worker. You can be a really dedicated father or mother and not have the capacity to show up as an equitable, loving, respectful partner. And so I think something I've been thinking about a lot is like helping people to understand earlier on in the courtship process, in the dating process, and I know you're thinking about this too, Debbie, how to recognize maybe not red flags or even pink flags, but yellow flags, right? Like I might really be attracted to this person. I might really even love this person. Are we compatible? Does this person support the kind of safety and respect that I deeply value in my life? And is that possible with this partner? Or do I let it go?
Jen, is there any way we could beg you to stick around through the commercial? Because I know Dave wants to ask about can somebody who commits domestic violence turn their life around and change their ways? Do you have a few minutes to stick around?
Yeah. Oh,
and
I'd
I
love
also
to
want to
talk
point
with you.
out that there were moments in the book, and by the way, we're talking about It Ends With Us, a movie that made $50 million at the box office this weekend and was a best-selling book as well. There were also some scenes in the book, obviously not included in the movie, where he was, in my view, very controlling, which led to me thinking there were some warning signs beyond physical abuse about controlling their lives, and I want to talk about that with you as well next. It's a movie about domestic violence based on a book. It's entitled It Ends With Us.
If one day you had a daughter, what would you say to her? She came to you and said the person she loved was hurting her. What would you say to her?
The main character, Lily Bloom, eventually does break the cycle by making the decision to divorce her husband right after she gave birth to their baby daughter.
This was a powerful movie. And apologies, there's going to be all sorts of spoilers because we're talking about it. It just came out, I get it, but it's been extremely popular. I think it made $50 million over the weekend. But this is something that affects 10 million Americans. I saw that from the National Institute of Health. 10 million Americans every single year are dealing with some sort of domestic violence in their relationship. And I watched this show, and I thought this was so profound. It got me looking at things differently and understanding that it's more nuanced than just the black and white of abuse is awful and unforgivable, and why can't you just leave that person after the first punch or the first piece of abuse? Why don't you just leave? That's kind of where my mind goes initially, and this show helped me realize there's more to it, Dave. There's families involved. There's marriages. There's a lot to this, and we have to figure out how to handle it.
And in the case of this character, Lily Bloom, her mom was subjected to extreme domestic violence at the hands of her father, which she witnessed. And she always promised herself that she would not end up in that same situation. Yet she marries a neurosurgeon, Jen Oxborough. Let's bring you back into the conversation. Jen has been working with families for decades here in Utah. She's a licensed clinical social worker. And breaking a promise to herself, which she was conflicted with. And, as I'm reading the book, listening to it on Audible, and then watching the movie, you can tell, she's conflicted with her own self over the fact that she stays.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. We see this as such a common feature of an intimate partnership dynamic, this conflict, right? This both and. I both love this person, and this feels controlling. This feels dangerous. I think it's a very there can be a lot of shame and a lot of guilt when people start to reflect that I saw some warning signs and I didn't leave, and I continued to further my life and my connection to this person. And so I really love this conversation that's coming forward from this movie and from your show today too. Thanks again for including me.
Jen, as I was watching the movie, and again, folks, if you're just joining us, we're speaking about the movie It Ends With Us. All sorts of spoiler warnings here if you haven't seen the show, but it's an important movie, I think, to discuss domestic violence, and we wanted to take that opportunity to talk about a sensitive subject, the most sensitive of subjects. One part of the movie, Jen, and I don't think you've seen this movie yet, but one thing
I have not.
this is what stood out to me is, at least in the movie, it seems to be more clear in the book, but the way they portrayed in the movie is the first couple instances of abuse. It wasn't entirely clear whether or not it was abuse, or maybe she fell down, or hit her head somewhere, or it was a mistake or an accident, and it wasn't until at the end that it made it very clear that yes, he was absolutely abusing her. But I wondered, is it common for there to be a justification, or do people say, oh, that was a mistake, it was an accident, didn't intend to? Is that a common thing to happen?
It is. It's very common. And often, Dave, what I see in folks that I work with is that there's a strong tendency towards codependence in a relationship that goes both ways, where I'm going to love this person through this. We're going to figure this out. We're going to go really deeply private with this. It's between us. We're going to get some help. I pushed his buttons. And where there's that intergenerational risk, I think that can be especially pronounced, right? If you grew up in a family and you saw this type of violence and aggression and control, and also you saw some love and you had some positive memories in that home too, it can become normalized in your head, both as the person who's perpetrating control and violence and aggression, and as the person who is being trying to survive it and being hurt.
Jen Oxborough is a licensed clinical social worker. We're speaking to her about the movie based on the book It Ends With Us. The movie was released this weekend. It did do well at the box office. It is about domestic violence, and I just want to give out this phone number, Jen, because I do not want to run out of time to give out this phone number.
Yeah.
800-799-SAFE. It's the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE. If you find yourself in a situation where you need help, that is the phone number that you can use. I also want to note that in the book, Jen, it was a little more clear to me that her husband was more engaged in not only physical abuse, but also very controlling behavior. For example, in the book, again, I apologize for people who haven't read it, he runs out and buys a beautiful apartment, a home, essentially, for them to live in without including her or telling her. And she gets to the home, he baits her there with a surprise, and she walks into this place, and then he surprises her and says, "Well, this is our home now. We're moving in." And in that moment, she's also conflicted with the fact that this should be a decision we both made, right? I mean, why is it just on him to make that? So there are other signs when I was listening to the book that told me that he was an abusive partner, that he wanted to control aspects of the relationship that should be decisions made by both partners involved.
Right. And I'm curious, I haven't read the book or seen the movie yet. My daughter saw it last night. We were talking about this in particular, that sometimes those gifts, sometimes those indicators of investment in a relationship can also have, here's more both and, they can also be both generous and controlling or isolating, more power differential. I'm going to make the decisions, the big decisions about the money, the career, children, family, those sorts of things. And it's not equitable. Those agreements that we make early on in our relationships are very, very important. And sometimes people don't feel safe to participate in that agreement-making process because they're scared or they're intimidated or they don't see a way to safely get away or have some distance from that partner.
This is a simple question with a nuanced answer, but I apologize. I don't know how else to ask it, Jen, but
that's okay.
Can abusers change? Can they get help? Or is this a one strike and you're out?
No, people can change for sure. Not everyone will, and not everyone wants to, and not everyone has the insight to change, but we can all change. I've worked with people that have hurt people, and there's usually a reason why. When you clarify their values, what they value is loyalty and respect and connection and family and power. And once you start to work through that and help people understand that you can have those things, you can attain those things through love and gentleness and respect and dignity. Once you clarify values, people can change, and you can get help at the number that Debbie shared, whether you're perpetrating violence or trying to survive it. There's help for everyone. What you can't do is change someone else. You cannot love someone enough to make them stop being violent. You cannot love someone enough to make them change their behaviors. We are all responsible for our own actions and values and decisions.
Jen, thank you so much for joining us. Jen Oxborough, who has been an advocate for domestic violence or fighting against domestic violence, a licensed clinical social worker. Thank you, Jen Oxborough, for joining us. And again, that number is 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 800-799-SAFE. That's the National Domestic Violence Hotline.
I also want to thank you, Dave. I want to thank you for your takes on this and for your insights on this. Such an important topic, and right from the gates this morning at 7 a.m., you leaned right into this, and you're like, we're going to talk about this on the show today.
KSL FM Midvale.
KSL Salt Lake City.
From the KSL Common Spirit Health Studios, this is KSL News Radio.
Utah's news, traffic, and weather station.